You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. We are on the campus of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. We're interviewing some of the professors here who also have books. And we're talking now with Bassam Haddad, whose book is Business Networks in Syria. Professor Haddad is head of the Middle Eastern Studies program here at George Mason. Professor Haddad, how would you describe Syria's economy as far as its structure?
Syria's economy went through a number of changes. It went from a centralized state-run economy to a mixed economy that involved some centralized state economy aspects and some market aspects, but not in the manner that actually allowed the market to be efficient at all.
When did this change occur from centralized to mixed?
Most of these countries, the late developing countries, after the post-colonial development, they underwent a period where they had to actually involve the masses in order to gain support and legitimacy. When this process, for a variety of reasons, began to create problems for the regimes in power, and when external support and pressure for some of these regimes and for some of the directions that were available at the time in terms of moving towards a market economy around the 1980s took place, you saw a lot of these third world regimes, or the global south, begin to move from a state-centered economy to a more market-oriented economy, and the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank played a role in doing so because they would literally place conditionalities on loans, and the conditionality involved moving to a market-oriented economy.
What role does an Assad regime play in the economy in Syria?
Well, the Assad regime from the very beginning, from 1970, when the father, Assad Sr., gained power, he was intent on bringing in, actually, the business community into the fold, even if in an informal manner, to actually revitalize Syria's economy after some years of serious marginalization of the business community by the same regime under a different leadership. So what Syria, or the Syrian regime, ended up doing is the subject of my book, which is basically it ended up selectively networking with big business in such a manner that allowed this state-business relationship to mature and develop from the 70s to the 1980s, and eventually hijack the economy in the 1990s in these what we call the business networks, or crony networks.
Now, who did the hijacking?
The state-business relations basically amounted to networks that ended up controlling the commanding heights of the economy. Of course, the state had the more strategic assets within its possession, but a lot of big business, individual business that are quote-unquote private, became very powerful players in Syria's economy in the 1990s and 2000s.
What are some of these businesses that we're talking about that are part of the networks?
Basically anything that involved big business, whether it's earlier on it was manufacturing in the 1980s and 1990s, and commercial ventures such as car dealerships and so on. But the manufacturing included everything from pharmaceuticals to ceramics to textiles. But in the 2000s, this became more of a telecom industry, free trade zones, and things that actually bring in a lot of money with a very high profit margin. And most of this money was siphoned off by these state business networks, and kind of left a majority of Syrians in much worse conditions than they were, because they actually, the regime that is, ended up also to quote-unquote save the economy, cutting down on subsidies on which most people relied. That took place for about 10 to 15 years and ended up in 2010, 2011 producing the kinds of both resentment and discontent that fed the uprisings.
So, Professor Haddad, who was getting the money, the profits in these business networks?
The profits went to the individuals within these networks. The people that are involved in these networks included state officials. These would be public sector managers, government employees at high levels, ministers. The prime minister usually was basically the nest, if you will, of a lot of these networks. And of course, folks very high up in the regime, including the ruling family. The point is that these networks, or the point of the book, is that these state business networks exist in every society, even in the United States, and they are usually, not always, but usually corrupt and problematic, and they siphon off a lot of money. However, in some areas, some countries, there are checks and balances placed on these networks, much more so than in others. And in a place like Syria, for a variety of reasons, these checks and balances were not sufficient to prevent these networks that operate anywhere in the world from actually running the economy into the ground.
So could you give us an example, number one, of this network that you talk about in the U.S., how it exists?
Well, in the U.S., for instance, after the invasion of Iraq, one of the major construction or reconstruction, quote-unquote, ventures was commissioned somehow or given somehow to various corporations that are very much in touch or close to or part of the network of, for instance, Vice President Dick Cheney. Whether it's Halliburton, Bechtel, and other companies, they ended up unfairly taking up these ventures, and actually they didn't do a good job at all by virtue of the results that we have seen several years later. So these kinds of networks were evident. The Enron scandal is another kind of such network. If you would like to look at a much bigger scale, the entire $700 to $800 billion bailout is a function of a very, quote-unquote, legal state business network that operates, that allows our system to bail out people that have caused the problem under legal pretense. The issue is, in countries like Syria, the amount of money is much smaller, and the checks and balances by whether it's the media or the democratic process, which is absent, and other civil society associations and power centers is absent, completely absent. So even though the pie is smaller, it's divided in an even much more inequitable way, leading to resentment that will push people to the streets, as opposed to the more democratic countries where these things happen, but there is a threshold and some democratic mechanism kicks in at a certain point, though it's important to not think that these things only occur in the third world.
So, Professor Haddad, what about the globalization of the Syrian economy? If a Marriott wants to open in Damascus or something like this, is it just purely private, or is there a state role in all of this?
It's actually been quite closed until the late 1980s. After the 1990s, the early 1990s, you began to see such ventures open up. The issue with places like Syria is that you can open up such ventures, and they are in existence today, and they actually proliferate. But a lot of these ventures are very carefully selected. As opposed to countries like Egypt and Tunisia, the Syrian regime has been very careful to limit foreign direct investment in any way, shape, or form. However, you'll find BMW, Mercedes, Nestle, Four Seasons hotels, chains, and so on. You will find them, but in smaller numbers, and they're always connected to some sort of a deal whereby the government has some control, if not over the ownership of the property, but the usage, some of the usage rights.
So how has the government made this system inefficient? What has caused the inefficiencies in the system?
The inefficiency is really a function of how economic decisions were made based on the interest of network members rather than on a broader economic strategy that charts a future for the country based on its resources, its endowments, its human and other resources. And in the end, you had what I call this circumscribed liberalization process, where the benefits of the economic liberalization process were siphoned off by these networks as opposed to being spread out into society. And in the end, these tailored policies became so rampant that they started producing contradictory outcomes. So you would have a certain connection that allows you, for instance, to monopolize the sale of certain brand of jeans or bananas, for instance. You actually are given some privileges and distinctions that allow you to set prices, and that ends up actually reducing competition, increasing the profit margin of people who are well connected, and reducing the ability of the economy to actually become productive, given that much of the support went into commercial and trade ventures, not into manufacturing and labor intensive